Good evening, everyone. It's always a pleasure to see familiar faces, friends of Avid, and also new friends who come together as we start a new chapter in the exploration of our maximum city, Mumbai. My name is Asad Lalji. I'm the CEO of Avid Learning. Some cities speak, others sing. Mumbai tells stories, and nowhere are those stories more textured and layered than in its architecture. This is the inspiration behind conceptualizing our new series, Motifs, Materials, and Makers, which will re-examine the rich design style that has shaped the city's distinctive architectural identity and how they two interact. Each episode will dwell into distinctive motifs that define a style, the materials that ground it, and the makers who brought these spaces to life with expert historians, conservationists, architects, and designers. We begin with the evocative Neo-Gothic style. Mumbai's Indo-Gothic ensemble is a living archive, from cathedral spires that pierce the skies to carved local stones that bear a touch of forgotten hands, of ambition, identity, craftsmanship, and continuity. Back in 2013, we celebrated the launch of Christopher London's book, Bombay Gothic. We have the publisher in the house. This evening, we will revisit the architectural style with the launch of our new series. It is a great pleasure to explore the story of the city through its built form with inspiring settings of the National Gallery of Modern Art, Mumbai, an enduring symbol of cultural and artistic evolution. This evening is especially meaningful to us as it marks our 50th collaboration with the NGMA. Our creative partnership began in 2011, and over the past decade, we have deepened our shared commitment to the arts, heritage, and public engagement. Tonight, we also begin an exciting new, equally meaningful partnership with the Indian National Trust for Art and Cultural Heritage, INTAC, Greater Mumbai Chapter, an organization whose commitment to heritage preservation has left an indelible mark on the city. A special thank you to Nidhi Chaudhary, Director, NGMA Mumbai, Deputy Curator Shruti Das for hosting us, and Ms. Katyani Agarwal, Convener, INTAC Greater Mumbai Bombay Chapter, for partnering with us on this series. And this brings me to the task at hand. Avid Learning, in collaboration with the National Gallery of Modern Art and INTAC, present Motifs, Materials, and Makers of Indo-Gothic Architecture. So please put your hands together and welcome our panel of experts. Founder and Principal, Heritage Synergies India, Komalika Bose. What's your name, Mr.? Director and Principal Architect, Five Cross Architects, Adil Dholokia. Professor, Department of History, University of Mumbai, Dr. Manjari Kamath. And our moderator for the evening, Assistant Professor, Architectural and Urban Conservation Program, Kavya Sinaya Vandrewala. Look forward to an exciting discussion. Thank you all for being here in such large numbers and bearing with us in our seating arrangement. Thank you, and over to you, Sinaya.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm going to quickly take you through explaining what the premise of today's panel discussion is going to be. That's about the Indo-Gothic architecture. I'll be explaining it through a few examples just so that everybody understands what we're talking about. The use of Gothic in Mumbai denotes the city's interaction with architectural forms on the world stage. In Mumbai, the confluence of varied forces created an Indian neo-Gothic style of rare charm. The buildings were site-specific, with a handmade appearance, showcasing various communities of India, animal and plant life, historic and distinguished local citizens in sculptural details. This construction phase was largely post-1860s after the demolition of the fort walls. In the 19th century, many distinguished architects and religious societies spread the popularity of the neo-Gothic style, leading to the eclecticism that established a great range of decorative options. Bombay Gothic has its design sources from Europe, adaptations to climate and sunlight in the local context, and enabling the architects to explore subtle shifts in the approaches to construction. One of the first ecclesiastical buildings in neo-Gothic style was the Afghan Memorial Church in Colaba, built in 1858, the one you see here. With many experiments in the city, Afghan Church was one of the first buildings to import stained glass, also to use basalt stone for exteriors and limestone for interior piers and arches. The next phase of high Gothic buildings were part of a densely grouped and planned section of public buildings built in a similar style as part of the new town, and the ensemble is unrivaled in the world. They form a spectacular skyline viewed across the Maidan and translated the builder's vision of the Anglo-Indian architecture into stone and built form. The David Sassoon Library and Reading Room, built in 1870, is part of this impressive group. Though small in scale as compared to the other structures, it employs various Indo-Gothic techniques, making it one of the most peculiar and distinctive buildings within the ensemble. The zenith of Bombay Gothic is well emulated within the CSMT building, formerly known as Victoria Terminus, built in 1888. It not only symbolizes the engineering prowess of Indian railways, but also forged the economic dominance of Bombay within the British Raj. It embodies the very essence of the collaborative nature of Indo-Gothic, using British design ingenuity and spectacular Indian artisanal construction, representing the idea of shared culture at its best. With homegrown engineers, artisans, JJ school sculptors using local material and construction methodology to represent the life in India that is carved in stone, it makes CSMT truly a worthy example of representing Mumbai to become internationally important mercantile city of the 20th century up to the present. I would like to now invite the next speaker to talk about a little bit about their work in context with Bombay.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here at an Avid Learning event in partnership with the other collaborators. This is a brief introduction of the work I do. I was awarded a MPhil and PhD from the University of Cambridge. Since then, I have been teaching at the University of Mumbai, Department of History. I'm also a research guide for PhD students. And apart from this, I'm a member of the Mumbai Heritage Conservation Committee at the MCGM, as well as a member of the Board of Trustees of the CSMVS Museum. I have also worked as Associate Dean for the Faculty of Humanities at the University of Mumbai. As far as my research publications go, I'll mainly have recent 2 books. One is Mumbai Past and Present. There's also a translation of this book available in Marathi called Mumbai Kal and Aaj, which was published by Nehru Center with Indus Source Books. Apart from that, a co-edited book came out in 2019 called Bombay Before Mumbai, which was the result of an international conference to honor the historian Jim Masselos. This was edited with Prashant Kidambi and Rachel Dwyer. As part of my work, of course, I teach several subjects, core and electives at the university, but in reference and in context to the event of today, one of the electives that I have been teaching for many years is the Urban History, Culture and Heritage course at the university. And as part of this, of course, many of my students are here. Apart from the classroom teaching, we also do what is experiential learning by actually taking them to the sites, doing heritage walks, showing them many of the buildings. And this is one such walk which we conducted. And of course, we are lucky to be at the center of the Victorian Gothic ensemble, which was inscribed as a UNESCO World Heritage Site, at the center of which is our own University of Mumbai Fort Campus building. So this has really helped in increasing awareness of heritage conservation amongst our students. We also do public outreach, as the university is a grade 1 structure, that is the Rajabai Tower and the Convocation Hall, which has also been awarded several awards by the UNESCO as for the restoration work. So I also do heritage walks in the University Fort Campus. For, we have done walks for Asiatic Society, for INTAC, and several other bodies, as well as for consulates. So some of the pictures you can see here, on the screen. So we do our best here to explain the kind of work which the university has done. And one of the things I would like to end this short presentation with is a recurring feature here has been that of public-private partnership. So a public university like University of Mumbai over the years has partnered with corporates to for restoration of these buildings and carrying forward this legacy. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone, and wonderful to see such a full audience, as Avid events always are, for this evening. And thank you, Asad, for the first of this new series that has us on the panel. Just a quick introduction before I move into my slides. I have largely for the last 15 years been working with in the domain of heritage, but more specifically urban conservation. I'm Kamalika Bose, and in urban conservation, I'm very interested in how cities evolved and grew from what the socio-political imperatives and the socio-cultural processes that then led to various stylistic developments and the evolution of architecture, which we then look at today and what we term today as architectural heritage. But what were the imperatives that led to the creation of architecture of different styles in different periods, and how did that sort of spread across the Indian landscape? So I have this. These are a list of some of the publications that I have been part of, which are in the domain, which I've co-authored or authored, which are in the domain of architectural history, but also stylistic evolution, looking at, and so I'm kind of interested in the colonial period to see not only what the colonizers or the British Raj was doing, but what the Indian elite or the native development that was taking place parallelly. So I have looked at Calcutta extensively, and then after moving, I researched on Mumbai, and I've been living in Mumbai for the last 10 years. So I also kind of find this as a very interesting point of comparison as to how colonial presidency towns, and especially towns like Calcutta and Mumbai, which are similar but also very different in their trajectories, grew. And through my books, which look at stylistic evolution, look at settlement and habitat and how that evolved, so those are some of the domains in which my research and publication, and therefore I also used to teach at CEPT, Ahmedabad, as a full-time faculty. So a lot of these have sprung from pedagogical research questions and converted into books, etc. So once I then moved to Mumbai in the last 10 years, there's been a very long-term association with Asad and Avid, and I've conducted multiple workshops and lectures for Avid and others as well. I used to teach as a visiting faculty in the urban conservation program at Kamla Raheja for a couple of years. And these are the kind of lectures and discussions and workshops that I have conducted looking at transition in architectural styles. So this was one that was a really interesting workshop we did called Gargoyles to Gateway. So we were looking at the architectural legacy of the British Raj in Bombay. How was colonial architecture used as a political expression by the Raj? So these are kind of questions that I've been researching in, and Avid has been a wonderful platform to then provide an area to discourse with the broader audience of scholars, but also the citizens and of Mumbai at large. And finally, I'm going to also talk about some projects that I then work on as one of the pillars, the other pillars of my practice, which is how do you bring design and how do you intervene into some of these historic structures. So in the last 4-5 years, I've been working quite extensively with the Indian Navy, and especially within the naval dockyard, which is just a stone's throw away at Lions Gate, and converted one of their Gothic structures, but not of the iconic kind, of the everyday, of the utilitarian. And the dockyard has many such utilitarian, military, and administrative structures in the Gothic style, but much more humane and much more everyday and ordinary. So how do you kind of give them a new life and talk about history, heritage? So this is something called the Legacy Gallery that I did for them in 2021. So these are kind of the various domains within which I practice, and I'm really looking forward to today's conversation. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Adil Dholakia, and I run the practice 5 Cross Architects out of India, Germany, and also now Egypt. And thank you so much, Asad, for having me on the first debut panel for the Avid Learning, and hopefully many more such. So Yes, at Five Cross Architects, we basically practice on 5 domains, which ranges from heritage, urbanism, architecture, and then ecology. And we test all of our projects with art and culture. And within these 5 domains, most of our project kind of have more than 3 or 4 channels kind of coming together. And that's how we then choose on how or where we want to intervene within each of these domains. And of course, my practice was established in 2021, and it's on the confluence of art, architecture, and technology as a byproduct of the 5 domains. We largely work with precincts, and the idea is to regenerate, encourage, and empower these communities and the precincts that we work within. And through the medium of affiliation and promotion with the civil society, with communities, with institutions, we try to bring a new angle into what these each domains can actually work on. The idea is, of course, to also focus on preserving and engaging with the communities, precincts, and the heritage objects that we work around with. So some of the projects that we work on kind of range from rural revitalization into conservation, ecology, landscape, and community development. And we worked on some large-scale ecological planning in the south of Germany. Currently, we're working on a medieval port town city in Gujarat, which is Bhadreshwar. We're looking at some ecological restoration work again in Bhadreshwar, which is the Fulsar Lake, which again is a 300-year-old lake. Starting off as in my own practice in 2021, we started working with the Dadar Flower Market, where we were also looking at communities and the sort of architecture in terms of development for the precinct itself. Another project that I worked on was in historic Cairo, a 16th century cattle house, which we converted into a community center. The idea of showcasing all of these projects, and I think very well kind of, put together in this makers, materials, and motives, because we felt that all of these projects had these elements. So some of the projects I wanted to take you through that has these aspects of the material, makers, and the motives. And again, similarly in Bombay, currently we're working on the Hamilton Studios. We're also doing a digital archival project with the MIT University in Boston, and there we're documenting about 750 buildings across India. Also, we have a collaboration with the Nymphenburg in Munich, which again is known for its sculptures and the material motifs put together. So the first project that I had worked as a student was the revitalization of the city of Seslak, and there we were also trying to work around a larger heritage management plan, focusing on the materiality of how the streets were laid out in terms of its relation to the buildings itself, and then this relation with the half-timbered architecture, and looking at the makers, or I would call it as a markers, looking at the majority of these central tower houses. And we built like a very strong resilience plan for this precinct in south of Germany. In Bhadreshwar in Gujarat, we were again looking at a medieval port town city, which was one of the first port towns in the 9th, 10th century. There again, we were looking at the materials in terms of the stone, and then how the makers, which also established that port town in the 10th, 11th century. So it was like over a transient period, and we're currently also looking at developing a large-scale conservation project around it. In historic Cairo itself, when we looked at the community center, a cattle house, the idea there again, because the makers were the Ottomans and the Mamluks, so we wanted to kind of explore what could this building serve as in the larger precinct of historic Cairo. So again, we built a resilience plan, and then we restored this 16th century cattle house into a full-fledged community center today. And there again, exploring the idea of the motives and the materials that came with it, with the makers, transienting over the 16th century. In Bombay, one of the projects that we worked on was the Bhuleshwar precinct, and we realized that these motives, material, and makers had to do a lot with the people, place, and the practice. And there we're currently making a research project in collaboration with INTAC, where we are also studying the crafts of the region. One of the projects that I am super proud of is, this project with MIT Boston, where we've taken up the challenge of documenting 750 Indian Islamic buildings from the 14th, 15th, and 16th century, and we've kind of devised a digital archive for over 40,000 artifacts, which has photographs, drawings, research material, and there again we started, identifying these markers for the project. And of course, this is going to be developing into a full-fledged open library, which is of course open to access. And again, there we came across a lot of these aspects, which today we will be also talking about in context to Bombay. And of course, all of our projects are kind of made possible with the collaborators, civic society, universities, and also allied practices. Thank you so much.
Thank you to all the panelists. It was good to give you the context of their practices and where their opinions and learnings come from. To briefly tell you where the panel discussion is intended to go lead us today is, we intend to visit the Indo-Gothic architectural ensemble of Mumbai, anchored by icons like the Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj Terminus, Rajabai Clock Tower, and Bombay High Court. These icons embody more than the colonial ambition. They reflect the complex intersections of power, identity, and placemaking. As post-colonial cities like Mumbai, it navigates their complex legacies. Indo-Gothic architecture offers a fertile ground for interrogating how these imperial aesthetics were imposed and indigenized. These structures, once emblems of Victorian modernity and British civic order, were profoundly shaped by local materials, climate, artisanships, and public aspirations, uniquely hybrid forms that resist singular categorization. Furthermore, the Indo-Gothic style invites a broader dialogue of modernity and tradition. Rather than viewing them as opposites, these buildings reveal a confluence of the two. In an era of rapid urbanization, Indo-Gothic architecture challenges us to integrate cultural heritage into future city making, moving beyond nostalgia to inspire sustainable, rooted, and inclusive urban design. Rather than relics, these structures are active agents in shaping urban identity, memory, and futures. With that, I open the panel discussion. With my first question to Dr. Kamath, how do you think the Indo-Gothic architecture has emerged in colonial Bombay, and what were its political and cultural motivations?
Thank you. So with regard to the contextualization of how it emerged, why it emerged in colonial Bombay, and the political and cultural aspect of this, in brief, I would like to say this, that most of the buildings that have been spoken about, whether it's the Victoria Terminus or the university buildings, Rajabai Tower and Convocation Hall, or whether it's the High Court, unlike what people think, just didn't come randomly. There was a vision behind this, and that vision is intricately connected to the history of our city. So how or why did they emerge? So this again was the vision of a governor of Bombay, Sir Henry Bartle Frere, and in the context of the mid-20th, in the mid-19th century, a lot of changes are happening in the city, some of which are the coming of the railways. We also have the starting of the university at that time, and there are other changes like the beginning of cotton mills. So a lot of changes happen in the mid-19th century. After that, in the early 60s, there is the need felt by the governor to have a ramparts removal committee and to bring down the fort walls. The reason why the fort walls were there in the first place was earlier, in the earlier centuries, to safeguard the city from attacks from the seas, whether it's by the Siddhis or they feared attack by the Marathas as such, or the Portuguese. So in the context of the period after 1857, that was not needed. So the coming down of the fort walls and this vast open area that was to be created as a result of it, there emerged this plan of having what later came to be known as Frere Town, or New Bombay, which is not the same as New Bombay or Navi Mumbai of today, but this was Frere's plan. And the plan emerged from this notion of making the city the urbs prima in Indus, the first city in India. As we know so far, if you look at the cities, Calcutta was much ahead in Bombay in every which way. And it was a capital, even at this time that we are talking. In the mid and late 19th century, Calcutta was the capital. But this emerged from this plan to make, the vision to make the city the first city of India. And he was under the impression that if you look at the urban fabric, that there is nothing which is impressive. It's all repetitive. And he felt that here was a wonderful opportunity to create something out of the land which is now going to be available. And that's how the idea of having these structures came. Secondly, the Gothic as a style was a much earlier European style from the medieval period. But from the mid-18th century onwards, it had once again come into vogue in Britain. So at this time, it was felt to have a kind of a Gothic revival, and therefore to have these buildings which are planned in the Gothic revival style. Of course, there are differences in all these buildings, especially there are architects sitting here who will speak more about it. But to have this style emerged from this, and the idea was to then have a secretariat, a university building, a high court, and all these buildings in a row. So when we speak of Gothic then, if you look at the all India level, this is the only city where you see these buildings emerging in a row. And almost, if you stand there, they're actually in one row. The High Court, the university buildings, there's a symmetry there. And so this is how it emerges. In terms of the political and cultural, of course, it symbolized the high noon of empire. And so the style and the magnanimity of the buildings reflected that. And culturally also it was felt to have the buildings which are imposing, which have variety. And so they were polychromatic, unlike if you look at Calcutta, if you look at these buildings, they are different in terms of color, in terms of stone. And so he felt that this would be much appealing. And last but not the least, the philanthropy aspect is also important. For some of these buildings, the funding came from businessmen in Bombay. This is also a time of especially the 1860s, of the cotton boom with the American Civil War and so on. So I think overall this was the notion behind it and the significance.
Thank you, Dr. Kamath. I think that quite well puts the entire perspective of how all of this, how the town came about. So since we were talking about these markers, Kamalika, my next question would be, do you think these buildings, how do you think these buildings work as vessels for collective memory and identity of the city? Because they were made with a certain intention. So do you think they kind of embody the idea of what, they would have embodied the idea of what Bombay was then? And what does it mean for it to be Mumbai now?
Absolutely. So I think one of the important points to remember at this point is that the Bombay Gothic that we are talking about, now Gothic architecture is largely, has sprung from the religious domain, from ecclesiastical architecture in the Western world as we know it. But when it comes to Bombay, it largely takes on a secular domain. And within that, it is largely public infrastructure and a civic mindedness on the part of the vision, both of the governor, and then how it was carried forward. So we see a range of typologies which emerge where the architectural style is Victorian Gothic, but we're largely looking at social, civic, and public infrastructure, be it railway stations, be it hospitals, be it education, schools, colleges, be it library, public libraries, of course administrative structures and government structures like high courts and the secretariat, etc. So there is this aspect of a new city and a new vision which is for public good, which is for social good, which is to create new kinds of a new kind of a public realm. So within that, I think a lot of those original intentions are still evident in today's use of these buildings, because a lot of these buildings maintain their original use. They are, as they have been nominated as the Victorian Gothic ensemble in UNESCO, we begin to see that the station buildings, the hospitals, the public nature of these buildings continue to remain, whether it's a university, and just the collective memory. Therefore, I feel there is a continuity in that journey, where when you move through, even if you don't understand anything about the Gothic movement, just buying a ticket and taking a train from CST gives you a different, allows you to experience that space. You may not know anything about the background but of who is Bartle Frere or what is the Neo-Gothic movement, but being able to experience these buildings as you move through the arcades, as you move through the Victorian arcades along DN Road, or many of these other buildings along the Esplanade. So I think the collective memory today, it's important to understand that continuity of use is an important way in which the public continues to enjoy and engage with these buildings, other than just look at them as spectacles and be an outside visitor who then looks at something which they're not able to access. And this is a very important point from a conservation lens as well, because the more as we move with real estate being a very big dimension, and with gentrification, we're seeing that some of these buildings, if we change the use, etc., may not remain as accessible anymore. And we're beginning to see some of that, say, in areas like Kala Ghoda, where the more we go towards luxury, the more we go towards retail, the more we, of course, I mean, there is a business logic to that, but the social mindedness and the public mindedness and the civic mindedness of the intention of such architecture then begins to take a back seat, and therefore then the collective memory will fade over time because they're not as accessible anymore. Thank you.
I know this might be a little too early to address the elephant in the room, but whenever we talk about colonial period architecture, the first question arises, is this Indian? So my next question to Adil is going to be, how does one understand this shift of public perception for these buildings, especially when we are seeing them, or we were seeing them as symbols of colonial power, to today where they are cherished landmarks? So in your practice, in your opinion, how do you think this perception has shifted, or how does it need to be shifted?
So I think it's the whole idea of, when someone comes to Mumbai for the first time, so there's always a memory that they associate it with. Maybe it's coming via the VT station, or, also standing next to the Gateway of India. Each of these precincts have a memory that's associated with the person. While, of course, it has, a timeline to the colonial period, I think it takes time for them to, absorb that idea of, what it meant at that point, but it is more about the person's identity. And I feel that, when we're looking at these objects more critically from a context perspective, we kind of fade it out from the context. We only look at the object themselves. And that's where, the difference also needs to be, focused upon. Addressing the idea of public's perception, I think, say, most of the people, the large masses who actually, go around these buildings are a little less interested in what happened in the past, but how today they are being used. So the contemporary use of these buildings are what people are associating their memories to. Maybe it is something to do with them coming to Mumbai for first time, or maybe, just seeing around these places. And because the identity of them are not seen in cohesion, but in isolation, so this entire transition that someone sees from a colonial period to today's time kind of gets lost in translation. At the same time, I think, like most of these buildings, and because of the urban pressure also, the whole return on, the per square footage, I think people are looking more on the return on identity today. And that return on identity has to do with why these buildings were made, whatever, 150 years old, 180 years, because it was about the necessity of that time in conjunction to the socio-cultural, economic, historical, and ecological perspective back then. When we look at these buildings, of course, they were indigenized and made using local materials, but with the idea of what it meant back home for them in terms of the materials. But then again, we kind of, blur out the identity of who made these buildings. There were Indian engineers, craftsmen, material was quite local. It was just the idea that was brought in from outside, and then it was kind of used with a local perspective. So, and the idea today is that it was also about today's identity and memory, and I think that's what people's perception are also moving towards for the masses. Of course, critically, we also kind of look at the entire heritage from a more broader perspective. So I think there's this disparity, and from a user to user, people are defining it basis of how they want to also be associated at a broader context. So that's how I would see these landmarks to be.
Our panelists have all spoken about, how these buildings are identity makers, and Kamalika mentioned about it being, built with the idea of civic mindedness, being in the domain of public infrastructure. One of the big infrastructures we see within this section is the University of Bombay, of course. And it's a big institutional building, a big infrastructure that was created. So Dr. Kamath, since, nobody better on this panel could understand, because of your vast experience with education in the city. This idea of the center of education and, the civic pride, do you think Bombay University kind of symbolizes that as part of, being part of the city's identity as an education center at that point in time, and how it has continued, or, how it has grown over this period of time?
Certainly, it does represent civic pride as well as being the center of education. If you look at those days, at the time when it was started in 1857, it was started after the University of Calcutta, then came University of Bombay, and then followed by the University of Madras. So in those days, if you look at the western part of it, Western India, then there wasn't a major sort of university imparting education as such. And so the demand for having a university here came from Indians. And here itself, in at the University of Bombay, in Mumbai, we had an exhibition where we had, portrayed this particular history, that the Bombay Association, which was mainly composed of the Sethias of those times, actually made an appeal to the government to say that we do need a university in this part of the country. And then, of course, the Woods Dispatch, and followed by the actual act, the act by which these three universities are formed. So definitely the history of the university and the history of the city of Mumbai is very intricately connected. If one looks at the book of the late journalist Dr. Arun Tikekar, who has written The Cloister's Pale, a biography of the University of Mumbai, then it again mentions to us how the histories of the two are connected. So the first thing I would like to say in terms of your question about civic pride and about being an educational center, once the university started, you see students coming from different parts of India and from the rural areas of the Bombay presidency of those times, whether it's Gujarat, whether it is Khandesh or Deccan or Konkan, students coming to Mumbai to receive an education. And when I say it's the university, of course, Rajabai Tar and the main university I'm talking, but what we need to consider here is the number of colleges which are affiliated to the university. Students are coming here to study. The university was modeled on the university of the format of the University of London, which is mainly a university with affiliated colleges. So yes, it does become a major educational center, and since then it has had an illustrious history. The very first graduates were the ones who were the pioneers of the social reform movement, whether it's Ranade and Bhandarkar and many others. With regard to civic pride as well, the university did not have these iconic buildings when it was started. So when the university was started, it was housed in the town hall, where today is the Asiatic Society of Mumbai. So the very first convocation took place there, which again shows the connection between these different, institutions. So our own university buildings were built in the 1870s and opened to the public in 1880. So with regard to the second aspect of your question of civic pride, once these iconic buildings were built, I mean, they were definitely a matter of civic pride. If we look at the records of those times and the books written, when people entered the convocation hall, which was known in those days as the Senate Hall, they were in awe of the structure. It was one of the biggest public halls in Bombay at that time. And if I may quote the late Sharda Dwivedi from the book of Dwivedi and Rahul Mehrotra, you find that apart from this, I mean, this is one of the biggest public halls. But even if you look at the Victoria Terminus, which is another building, it was the most photographed building in the country next to the Taj Mahal. So we are talking of iconic buildings here, but particularly with regard to the university, the Rajabai Tower, you can imagine even today with so many towers, it is a towering structure in that area, and one can't but sort of admire the architectural marvel, the clock tower and the convocation hall. So both in terms of being an educational center and a civic pride, I think the university played a very big role, and continuing to this day, I think most of us sitting in this NGMA are alumni of the University of Mumbai, and it has produced people from all, I mean, whether it's business or sports or different cricket or various fraternities, and it has also, we are proud to have, I think, 5 Bharat Ratna awardees who are the alumni of the university. So, yes, I mean, it continues to be a matter of civic pride and an educational center. Today, there may be many other universities, there are private universities, but can we name a university which has like more than 900 colleges and 60 departments, whose jurisdiction spans the beautiful coastline of Western India right till the borders of Goa, and continues to do this work till today. Thank you.
So while we are mentioning about education and universities within the city, of course, the JJ School has to be mentioned as a very iconic structure and institution. And then from JJ School, obviously, we end up talking about architecture, which is the whole premise of the panel discussion today. Kamalika, what do you think the architects can learn from this hybridity, between the Indo-Gothic architecture, the balancing of the Victorian aspirations and the Indian traditions?
So, fundamentally, if we look at the evolution of the style, which is Victorian Gothic, of course, it has many connotations linked to the imperial ambition, the involvement of the Indian elite and the philanthropic aspect. But if we kind of keep aside all of these aspects and just look at the architectural dimension of it, of the form, of the typology, of the style and the elements, if we look at it as a moment in time. Because if we look at Bartlefrey's governorship in Bombay, his governorship was about for 5 years, between 1862 and 1867. But the Neo-Gothic project continued for about 30 years. Over the period of time that this, all of these buildings came up, because obviously this vision could not have been fulfilled in that 5-year tenure that he was governor. So therefore, if we look at this as a moment of time, after which there were new parameters. There was the question of nationalism growing at the turn of the century, and a newer awakening towards nationalism, and then the style changed, right? We get Indo-Saracenic, which becomes the next one, and then Art Deco and so on. So if we look at the evolution of architectural style as directly the genesis of the style coming from socio-political, socio-cultural, socio-economic imperatives, we will be able to understand this aspect of hybridity or the composite nature of when does it remain a pure style, when does it become a hybrid style where you then try to amalgamate another influence. All of those have bearings on who's in power and what the political climate and socio-economic climate of that city is. And I think that becomes very important as a crucial factor for students of architecture and practitioners to learn from, that architecture is rooted in time, context, and all the factors and forces through which it is born. And then a style is never stagnant, a style will change, and Bombay shows that through every slice of time. And even the Neo-Gothic was not born in a vacuum, was not born in a tabula rasa. There was a style which preceded it, and then we see that a lot of those buildings, a lot of the neoclassical buildings of Bombay, a lot of the utilitarian buildings from the company town era, when the Raj had not yet set in and it was the East India Company which was operational, a lot of those buildings were actually demolished and flattened for the new style, the subsequent style to emerge as the shifts started taking place post the Battle of Plassey and then post it coming under the Crown, etc. So if we are able to understand a change and evolution of architecture, architectural form, architectural expression, in relation to this, I think that's where the main learning lies, that even when you look at what is there to take in, that is one aspect, that how do you then respond to the context that you're working in today. And then, of course, there's the aspect of the hybridity itself, which is how does, if you look at the plans, for example, of each of these typologies that I mentioned, whether it's a hospital or a railway station, you will be able to partially, just in the space planning and the layout of these plans, be able to find many similarities, because they're essentially, they come from the same idea of responding to climate, and therefore the kind of verandas that you have, the kind of sunbreakers or jalis that some of them have. Of course, the iconography is a different aspect, but the just space making of it responds. So there were design innovations that take place. So what we are calling as hybrid today was the amalgamation of a European imagination of space, but overlaid on Indian principles of space making, and then you get that hybrid space, which is then overlaid with expressions, be it statuaries, be it iconography, and a lot of that is also then the local flora and fauna, Indian flora and fauna that you see, and not the kind of flora and fauna that we see in the Notre Dame Cathedral, while there are similarities in how the types of, whether it's gargoyles, whether it's buttresses, but there is an Indianization with schools like JJ School and Lockwood Kipling, etc., facilitated that in the kind of, whether it's the market buildings such as Crawford Market, or whether it's, of course, the CST station itself. So there is at every layer you are able to recognize elements of this composite exchange between, I think Anthony D. King writes in his book about, the hybrid nature of colonial architecture, where there is a host culture, and then there is when it meets the local culture, what happens when there is an assimilation that takes place. And of course, these are theoretical and discussions in the way colonial architecture then meets a local architecture. And a third type, he talks about the third type which comes out of it, which is neither purely colonial nor purely Indian, but somewhere in between. And that is when a unique typology takes place. What happens when bungalows take place? Because bungalows were not there, as we understand it, before the British time. And bungalows were taken from the vernacular, but imposed upon the idea of the garden house or the villa. And then what we get as a direct result of colonialism is the bungalow that then gets transported across all the colonies across the world. So when you talk about, just to conclude, this idea of hybridity, we need to understand it as in totality and not just visual hybridity.
Since Komalika mentioned design innovation, well, we have to look at to the economics of the heritage, and you know how these traditional materials and methods can be incorporated into contemporary design and conservation practices. Adil, could you give us some good examples where this has been executed, whether it's within your practice or in the larger conservation field?
So when we talk about traditional materials being used in contemporary design, I think we kind of always get scared because it's always the notion has been put that it's very expensive. But the idea is that because, the way it has been done before, if one has to also think of it methodically, it's actually quite easy. It's just one has to follow the technique of using these materials in new projects, so to say. Like, for example, the use of lime plaster, back then, the way it was prepared and used as application, today we see it as we see it as a material which is complex, but when we extrapolate that over 10 years, we see the impact of that on new architecture. When we look at, say, wooden joineries, and an example from our practice about the Hamilton Studios itself. So when we started that project in 2023, like, for the first couple of months, it was just a dialogue between the owner and us. And we were just, documenting that space. And we realized that, a lot of it was left unfinished in terms of its joineries, in terms of, the partitions, in terms of moldings within the building. And we said that, okay, we have also the task of completing that today, almost 98 years later. And we said, how do we go about it? Is it that we go back in time, try to interpret it, and then kind of finish the puzzle? Or we kind of take clues from what's already existing and then contemporize it? And then, of course, the idea of taking these clues and coming up with simple joineries, I think they add a lot of value in today's contemporary times, where we're also kind of reserved in exploring them. A similar project that we're doing also in Khandala, which is now is a 200-year-old abbey, and wherein, of course, we've not started working on it, but we're already identifying issues, say, with the building fabric itself, and we want to find solutions of how to kind of sustain it, preserve it. Of course, in contemporary architecture, again, use those same technologies, ideas of how the wooden trusses were used, and then kind of use it in the new architecture, because there again we're coming up with a spin-off, a new architecture within a heritage precinct, and we want to kind of translate those ideas within the projects that we're doing. Again, when we look at buildings in Bombay, I think through the evolution of how the conservation for Bombay has evolved over the last 25-30 years, we see these interpretative use of materials, technologies, and with the advent of information that we have at hand, which back then, of course, was not so widely available. The methods can be quite extensive. It's about the interpretation and how one would like to use it in application, so that we're not just sustaining a certain building fabric, or we're not kind of just translating an idea onto a new architecture. The idea is to explore it a bit more in depth. Again, the experimental nature that conservation kind of allows us, it doesn't come with a fixed manual. As you kind of work with the building, the solution comes, and those solutions, as translated in new architecture, that's the contemporary need today. A lot of the practices who are also focusing on vernacular architecture as a new medium are actually using the same mediums to work on the projects. And that's the real translation of identity, methods, technology that one can look at when they're focusing on these new architectural interventions. The idea is to keep it simple, keep it clean, but I think between contemporary architecture and say conservation of old buildings, the idea of reversibility is missing. So in new architecture, we kind of make an intervention and then we done and dusted there. But with old buildings, with heritage objects, we have the possibility of reversing them. In case we've overdone something, we do not go back in new architecture and correct them. But in heritage conservation, we have that opportunity at hand. So with these traditional methods and technologies, it's more like a a framework to work in, and then to translate them in contemporary use. So that would be my response to how in today's time we can use these traditional ideas.
Thank you, Adil. So heritage is often considered elite. You know, we always hear about this, that it's not accessible largely to the public. So how do we begin to decolonize this narrative, Dr. Kamath? You know, especially when in our context we're talking about Indo-Gothic architecture.
Right. So in terms of access, I think already the panelists have pointed out that these are buildings, most of them, I think a majority of them, are functional buildings. So in that sense, whether it's a railway station like the Victoria Terminus, the CSMT of today, or the university buildings or the High Court, many of the buildings that we spoke about, there is a public access to it. And I think that, as my fellow panelists have pointed out, is its forte, because the railway station is a functional building which is used by so many every day. And also the fact that people coming to Mumbai are visiting the place, and every time one walks by or one is in a bus or a car, I think no matter how busy one is, one spares a minute to look at the building and really be awestruck. Even till today, I think that happens in a way which doesn't happen at other buildings. So I think that building is, and also in terms of access, it's used, it's the main lifeline of the city. So if you're talking of access, then it's a building which is has been used, was used in those days. In fact, the first railway line in India was from Bombay to Thana in the whole country. This was a first, just like there are other firsts, like the first municipal water supply was Bombay, or the first session of the Congress for the Indian National Movement was held in Bombay. So there are many firsts, the first railway line. So continuing to this day that, it remains. Looking at, again, the High Court, it's again a functional building. The university buildings, I think thousands of students have got their degrees from there. To this day, the convocation hall is used for the annual convocations of the university. And even if you look at the other buildings, I would just like to say here, because it's what the question now applies in general to the Indo-Gothic buildings. So most of the Indo-Gothic buildings, I think, are for churches. I have Ms. Kirtida Unwala, who's sitting here, who has beautifully restored the Afghan church. So when we speak of Victorian style, we are also talking of buildings like churches, which like the Afghan church, or whether it's Mount Mary, and there are other churches of this style. There were also palaces which were done in this Indo-Gothic style. And then, of course, there are buildings which are secular, like if you look at the architecture of the university buildings or the other buildings panelists have spoken about, they are secular architecture. So in terms of access, they continue to be used, whether they are churches or university buildings or railway stations. And the other thing I would like to flag off here is the maintenance and the conservation of the building. Again, as a city, we are proud that the city is the first to pioneer heritage legislation in the whole of India. I think we can take pride in that. And thanks to that, there has been a gradation of the buildings where many of the main iconic buildings, the Gothic buildings that we have spoken about, are grade 1 buildings. So we are rest assured that there are heritage rules and regulations for the conservation of these buildings. And I must take the opportunity also today to express our gratitude to the conservation architects who have done a huge amount of work, because it's not easy to do restoration work on these buildings, especially on the grade 1 buildings where there are so many regulations. But the architects have worked on these and restored them to the state where they are today. And not just that, but they have won international recognition for this. Many of these buildings have, including if you look at our university buildings, have won 3 UNESCO Asia Pacific Awards in 1998 for the work on the stained glass. I don't know whether Ms. Swati Changatkar is here today. She was supposed to come. And Vikas Dilavari, which was a collaboration between the university and the British Board of Trade, or whether it is which won an award, or it is 2007 with the aid of the government of Maharashtra and the Tata Group, that the magnificent Convocation Hall was restored, which again won an award. And the more recent one is the restoration of the Rajabai Tar University Library, and that was done by the SNK, which is now Somaya and Sampath group, which again won the UNESCO Asia Pacific Award. So in terms of access, they are functional buildings, and I'm told by Mrs. Somaya that one of the things which university had made very clear is, while the restoration work is going on, the university library and the functioning of that building was not going to come to a halt. Neither was the clock going to stop. So it was, one had to take care. Again, these are functional buildings, and again, I express gratitude on this occasion to our architects who have worked on these buildings, and thanks to the fact that they are maintained in that condition, that there is, there's access to these buildings, and that continues to this day.
Since Dr. Kamath mentioned about so many awards, the historic buildings in Bombay have received, of course, we have to mention the UNESCO inscription, the World Heritage inscription for Victorian, Gothic, and Art Deco ensemble in 2018, which was a landmark moment for the city. Now, getting that recognition, of course, has effects on both policy and practice. Adil, what have you noticed within the field of the difference in or changes in the policy or the field of conservation, practice conservation, where this sort of getting a UNESCO tag kind of, whether it works kind of in for the city or it kind of brings in more legal complications?
So I think with the recognition of the precinct in the UNESCO, I think what has kind of led to is the citizens' participation for this whole recognition. Because it was led by the citizens, I think there is this onus amongst the residents who stay there within that block. And I think that was a movement. And I think it has, and it should also have a ripple effect beyond just the buffer zone, because people have become sensitive. They want to recognize, the city's heritage, legacy, the identity that it comes with, because at this fast pace, development pressure that Bombay has, a precinct that can actually be sustained, I think that is one thing. Secondly, I think it has put heritage, and it has given heritage a seat at the urban planning perspective, which earlier was not there. So I think a lot of the ripple effect that we should be seeing should also come out from the perspective that heritage today will also play a very strong role in the urban development. And with that sensitivity going forward, I think it has set also like a template again, that other precincts in Bombay can also be nominated for similar recognition. And I think this is just the start, and because while also assessing or seeing that nomination, the enthusiasm that the community or the citizens come with, of course there are pros and cons to it. There are loopholes that developers actually want to find to develop around it, but probably talking only about the good things that it comes with, it's given that identity to Bombay also as a collective. Because while there are individual conservation projects, restoration projects going on, adaptive reuse of old buildings, as a precinct that is being sustained for, part of it being recognized for a certain stylistic idea, I think this is just the start. And I think there'll be many more to come in the years. With also, Art Deco completing 100 years, I think it's also important that as mass for the city, we start understanding the movement that it came with. So again, from a policy perspective, people will come around with the loopholes to develop around it. But I think it should just be the start to something even greater of recognizing Bombay's legacy. And I think that would be the recognition, say, at the policy level. At the practice level, citizens themselves have started realizing the importance, and of course they knew about it. That's why most of the owners who stay within these Art Deco buildings are, trying to maintain it at their own cost. But with a collective effort, the impacts are larger. There is a broader perspective that can be seen. Yeah, of course, it has impacts at the economical level for those buildings themselves. But I think here it's about the collective identity for that movement. And I think with the whole recognition, Bombay has set that mark point at also a global level, because Art Deco was not just about Bombay. In Cairo, you see them. In New York, you see this. So as coming together, I think that recognition was very important for the city of Bombay. And I think going forward, it would be interesting to see that how that sustains over a period of time. Because the recognition, of course, is contingent to the fact that the core zone and the buffer zone kind of retain that identity. And I think with the enthusiasm that the citizens have for this precinct, I think it will be interesting to see that in the years to come. Thank you.
Since we've been talking about, the dossier, the nomination dossier being a citizen-driven, citizen participation and engagement idea, Kamalika, in your experience, what do you think the community engagement and the public play a role, especially when it comes to activating these heritage spaces? And of course, with keeping in mind, we are talking about within the context of this Indo-Gothic architecture and Mumbai.
So this is, I think, one of the most important aspects that this whole aspect of ownership and public engagement. And while it is well established and well documented, the conservation movement of Bombay is well documented and recorded. Who were, this entire aspect of citizen-led, citizen-owned, and citizen participatory way in which even the nomination was made successful. There's a broader question of wider public engagement with those who are not direct stakeholders of this site, beyond those who live and work in this precinct. How do we make those who are not the converted, as I say, those who anyway don't love, they already love and appreciate these buildings, they don't want to see it demolished, but there's a much wider public at large who are also residents of this city, who may or may not value it or see it in the same spirit. So when we talk about public engagement, I think that becomes important, that how do we go beyond those who are already converted and those who love this kind of architecture and this the neo-Gothic heritage of Bombay. And there I feel that activating these spaces, we spoke about the civic mindedness and the public realm, activating the public realm and keeping it active through the year is a very important and good way to make this happen. And we see every year what happens when the Kalakura festival takes place. We see how the David Sassoon Library, and I'm just citing that as one example, comes alive when the literature panel takes place in the gardens, etc. And there are all kinds of people from all walks of life who don't live anywhere in town or in South Bombay come specifically for this, and how so many of the buildings, the arcades, get activated in that time. But sadly, we don't see this sort of all year-round activation that takes place. And therefore, they become events in our calendar where we look forward to going there, but the rest of the year, we just look at it. We kind of forget about it and get busy with the lives. And I'm talking about the larger, people who live in the suburbs, people who are like recent migrants to the city, they don't know anything about the history and heritage. So when we talk about public engagement, we need to widen the conversation and widen the discourse and see what are the ways that we can long-term activate the public realm and make sure that even the non-converted begin to find a value to this. Otherwise, for them, it will remain a utilitarian thing, passing through the portals of CST station to catch a train, or going to the JJ hospital for a health checkup or something. But that value will not enhance beyond the utilitarian and the functional aspect. So in public engagement, it's very important to not, rest on your laurels of what has been done, but continue to see new ways, because Bombay is such a dynamic city that every day there are so many new people arriving into the city, and what does this heritage mean to them? There are always these questions of whose heritage and all of that. Those questions are right in their own lens, but what does it mean to the current residents, to the future residents of people who will be arriving into Bombay like 1 or 2 generations or a few years from now? And how do we make them value or see the value of not only the Victorian Gothic, but all the various collective, the composite built heritage of Bombay that all of us love and cherish.
Okay. I'm going to ask all my panelists to play favorites now. So if you were to pick one Indo-Gothic structure which you think would kind of embodies the spirit of Bombay, talking about in context with the idea of identity of the city and the layered history, what would it be if each of you could pick one, your favorites?
So I think for me, one of the favorite structure is, of course, our CST station, because I feel that other than it having a colonial memory, which the panelists have so in depth spoken about, I think it has a people's memory. And that is what I think, is kind of striking to me, because every time that I pass from there, you see someone looking up to that structure and, kind of going back in time, or, maybe just kind of looking at it from a perspective of city's identity. And it's like a proper master class, when it comes to talking about Indo-Gothic architecture, because every time you go in there, you see a certain detail that would, really inspire you to look at it more in depth. Maybe it is about the openings, or it is about the technical details that it comes with. And I think the most important thing, because Bombay being such a fast-paced city, I think the VT station kind of is always in motion. And that idea of motion and continuity that in today's time we find within a heritage infrastructure, I think that would be one structure that I look up to.
Yeah, of course, they're all iconic structures, and we like all of them, but I would like to stress on the university buildings here. That's the Rajabai Tower and library, the convocation hall, that is the university complex. For 2 or 3 reasons. One is that the university is a center of learning, and most of us have been through, the portals of the university and received an education there. And in Mumbai, I think most of the people in different fields are those who initially got their education in the university. So in terms not just of the stone and the architecture, but also of its contribution to the city, and if I may say, to the world, I think I would, I think that's a favorite. Secondly, also, I would like to stress here, given the theme of this panel of motifs, materials, and makers, if you look at the motifs here, again, they are a combination of it's Indo-Gothic, because you see the flora, it's our own flora and fauna, as well as you see Shakespeare and Homer there inside in the statuary. So I think it's that combination which also is something which I am impressed by. And I would also like to say here, because George Gilbert Scott, was the renowned architect of Gothic revival, although he didn't come here, has designed those buildings. But at the same time, the people who worked on these buildings were Indians, whether it's the craftsmen, and today we must mention in the same tone Mukund Ramchandar and the others, the contractors, and those who day and night sat, worked on these buildings. So I think that also is important, that these are our buildings, as well as the students of the JJ school who were responsible for the statuary. And last but not the least, if you look at the present, the 2018 inscription of the Victorian Gothic and Art Deco as UNESCO World Heritage Site, if we go to the UNESCO website and look at the reasons or the rationale for giving that award to the ensemble, it's very clearly written that the height of the Rajabai Tower and the integrity it maintains on the surrounding area with the oval and the surrounding buildings, where on the other side, on this side is the 19th century Gothic, across the oval is the Art Deco, and of course there are others, Indo-Saracenic like the CSMVS and others, and the integrity maintained by the tower in the surrounding landscape was one of the key reasons for awarding the ensemble as a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And therefore, globally, I think our place is right there. And of course, I would also like to say here that if we think at a global level, then Gothic is something which is there also in Harvard and the Ivy League universities. If you look at the buildings, many of the buildings there, it's a different kind of Gothic, which I think is known as collegiate Gothic. There's also perpendicular Gothic, but mainly collegiate Gothic. So I think underlying this, the university buildings also with the Venetian Gothic style are also meant to globally, signify those, that kind of architecture which is there in the world's best universities.
So for me, of course, there are all the favorites which define the high noon, as Manjari put it a short while ago, and the climax of Bombay Gothic. But one of the buildings that really fascinates me, I'm yet to actually step into it, is at one corner of, so I'm actually more fascinated by the uniconic Gothic structures, which are more everyday or are more humane in scale and, sometimes not looked at, therefore, as carefully, because we are obviously so much more taken in by the high Gothic buildings, is at the corner of Dhobi Talao, and when Dhobi Talao, you're moving towards the BMC headquarters. So this was, back in the day, the old Elphinstone High School, built by David Sassoon, which is today the Maharashtra Department of Directorate of Technical Education. And why that building really fascinates me, and I've passed by it so many times, is for 2 or 3 reasons. One is that it's very long. So more than the height, it has this kind of horizontality and a very long facade, and it's very grounded. So if you see the station or the BMC headquarters, etc., those buildings are directly on the street. You can access and enter them from the street level. Whereas this one, it is almost it has this ceremonial set of steps that go on. So the ground plane of that structure is actually at the first floor level, and that is actually a very classical way of approaching and accessing buildings, the way we see Asiatic society, where you have to kind of, and therefore that gives it a sort of monumentality and a scale, but otherwise it's a very humane building compared to other structures along the esplanade. The other reason that really fascinates me, therefore, is originally, since it was meant to be a school building, how these steps would have been animated and become a public realm again, of how and the possibility it also gives us today. But sadly, what has happened is they have, along the facade, gone and installed these very ornate but very tall and high gates, which obviously remain closed when the office hours are over, etc. So the building is really cut off from its public realm, from its street, which neo-Gothic buildings primarily are meant to have a very direct interaction with the street. It's almost like from the sidewalk you can just walk into the building, which is, I think, it's taken away from the original intention of the building. But I'm really fascinated by this incorporation of a ceremonial set of steps which then lead into the building, and I'm hoping to sort of go into it at some point and discover what lies beyond.
So thank you all the panelists for, kind of emphasizing on the historical, social and economical context. For Indo-Gothic, talking about its contemporary relevance and its importance in today's time. And with that, I would like to open up the floor if there are any questions from the audience. And if you could keep the questions brief and concise, please.
Very wonderful to understand the context in which these buildings came up. But there's still a black box in my mind as to how these buildings, sprung up. The title suggests motives, materials, and makers. I would also like to inquire about the methodologies behind how these buildings came up. There's this notion, at least in my mind, I don't know if the larger public also shares this, but it feels that these buildings have association with history, which is obvious, but it also feels that today these have become sort of a puzzle that we no longer know how to solve. In that, I'm inquiring if one wants to sort of venture into building such structures again, what goes into making these? Like, obviously, materials, makers, and as I said, also methodologies. It's not as accessible and known. I realize that we are trading speed in sacrificing all of this, but where do we stand in not being able to see such structures come up again, and why?
So you're talking about the use of traditional methodology of construction material in contemporary times. Is that what your question is?
Yeah.
So while I agree with you that today it's more of a challenge, but there's also the experimental nature which lacks in the domain per se of development. And I think it's this systems which we are very scared to explore on. And that's been a question in my mind, that why don't we dare to build something similar? Why don't we dare to even document something of a scale of that across Bombay? The starting point, of course, was the nomination for the ensemble, but I think that's a start, and the ripple effect that you will see in the time to come will probably also be reflective of that. So there is this starting point, and I think over this period of next 20, 30 years, you will see that translation also happening. But primarily at this stage, we are racing against time. The pressure is enormous, and we don't want to experiment. And that's why this lack of this similar building systems we see in Bombay. At least that's how I would see it.
One last question, because we are running out of time. Somebody from this side? Yes, ma'am.
We are also talking about all the change that has come about, and say for people who have had a convocation certificate that said University of Bombay, for us also it has been a long journey. So my question is, how do we retain both these identities without making it into a big controversy and, kind of trying to uniformly stamp out everything that was done?
I think no matter what the name is, the iconic buildings are there, and it remains like the function for which these buildings were built, that remains to this day, whether it's the railway stations or the universities. So, the main functionality of education or transport, and that continues. So I don't see, I don't see what else can be done. I mean, there are certain things which obviously we can't speak on this panel. So irrespective of the name, I'm glad that the government, in partnership with these institutions, has taken a big step forward, unlike other cities, of restoring these buildings to their glory. And I think we are thankful for that.
So,
thank you.
Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Just to add to your thank yous, we have representatives of Mr. Gagrani's office sitting here, and they're working on so many conservation projects. You've obviously mentioned the iconic conservation architect sitting in the room with us, so it's very endearing. Thank you, Kamalika, Adil, and Dr. Kamath for these insightful comments, and Sanaya for steering this conversation so well. Maybe we'll hit you up for the next one round in the series. But just to add to one thing Kamalika was saying, you talked about the David Sassoon Library and comes alive only during Kalagora. So you'll be happy to know Avid Learning and Kalagora Association are going to be doing regular programs at the library to keep it active. So we'll get more people coming and experiencing the architecture, and the restoration of that project is also quite special. Thank you to our partners, the NGMA, Nidhi ji and Shruti for hosting us, and Intact Greater Mumbai Chapter, Ms. Agarwal, and the other conveners for being a partner. And we look forward, and firstly, thank you guys. We have close to 200 people in this room. Sorry about the seating arrangement. I guess Gothic is a very popular topic. Thank you for being here. The next edition of this series will be in August, but before that, we have our next edition of the Icons of Bombay on July 2nd. You may have seen some of the ads, where we're going to look at fountains, BST buses, and street food. In case you're free this weekend, we're going to have a very interesting podcasting 101 workshop where you learn about discovering your voice and sharing your stories, and many other programs. To find us more, just check out our website or stalk us on social media like normal people do. But thank you all for being here. The panelists will be here for a short while, but we are actually supposed to vacate the building by 8 o'clock. Thank you. Have a good night.